So Wall Street had to write us a check for $5 billion.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Vision Business Talks. Today, we feature Professor John DeVoy that will give us a very insightful overview on basically his experience within hedge funds and experience with distressed debt, talking about his career from biologists, the studies of biologists, to investing basically, and how does it feel like to become a professional investor who essentially has managed to spot the 2008 crisis. So first of all, I would like Professor John DeVoy to introduce himself and quickly talk us about his career development.
Sure. So again, my name is John DeVoy, and I've been a lecturer here at Boston University since 2013. But at the start of my life, I thought I wanted to be a physician. So my mother was a nurse, and she told me, do well in school, you can be a doctor, your life will be great. Fast forward until I'm in my final year at Harvard. I was a chemistry major for 3 years. In my 4th year, I started hating chemistry lab. That's 8 hours watching drops go into a tube. And I said, I'm switching to biology. And over my entire academic career, every physician I spoke with said, run away from this career. It is terrible. I wouldn't do it again. So I said, what can I do? I still have the option to apply to medical school later. What can I do for a few years to decide, do I want to go to medical school? Business school is only 2 years. I could go get an MBA and then be a doctor, and in theory I would be the manager of a team of doctors. So that was my idea. I get to business school not knowing if I would like it or not. I take operations, finance, marketing, and quantitative management my first semester, and I loved marketing. I loved operations. I liked finance. I did fine at it. It wasn't interesting. It was discounting cash flows, a little corporate finance. The best decision I ever made in my life is I took the next class called investments. So I declared as a marketing concentrator. Next semester, I take investments, which is the famous Bodie Kanan Markets investment textbook, and 3 classes in, sitting in the back of the room at 22 years old, I said, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. That's how much I liked the material.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. And then fast forward, your first experience, right, in a fund.
Yeah.
How did you start? As an analyst covering debt, and then what brought you to essentially spot the opportunity that was coming in 2008 and actually to bet against something that everybody was looking at as something that could have never, dropped, could have never failed, basically.
Yes. So I applied to 99 equity analyst positions and 1 credit position because I had never heard of bonds as a career. I got the job in debt. And when I interviewed and the people that worked there told me their day-to-day job, it was the identical to an equity analyst. So I started as a generalist covering automotive, aerospace and defense, chemicals, because remember I had a chemistry background, oil and gas. And I spent my first 5 years covering investment grade and a little high yield. Once you cover investment grade for 3 or 4 years, you realize this is not risky enough. It only gives me returns of 4 or 5% a year. I wanted to go after stuff that gave me returns of 8 to 10. So I raised my hand and said I want to be the high yield analyst only. I had to leave the insurance company I was at and go to a famous money manager in Boston called Loomis Sayles, who specializes in high yield. I get to Loomis Sayles at the height of the telecom crisis in the US. So 2002, every telecom tech company almost in existence went bankrupt. I was the analyst. So now I learned what happens when a company goes bankrupt. How do I know what my claim on those assets are? How do I know whether I'm going to get my entire investment back or just a little of it? By going through those, I learned what happens in a distressed situation, and that's how I was able to finally interview and successfully get to Baupost by having those 15 bankruptcies under my belt.
Sure.
At Baupost, one of my main jobs was to look for distressed debt longs. What is something we can buy at 20 or 30 cents that will get par back? However, at the same time, hedge funds are constantly making you look for industries that everyone likes right now that they think could do really badly. So short bets.
Yes, they're top, and you bet that there will be
Yes.
down basically.
So when the fund that I left, I was looking at potential shorts, and I came across the subprime mortgage originator space. I looked at the underwriting standards. This will blow you away. So for the prior 100 years in the US, when we had never had a major housing downturn, never on a nationwide basis, these were the underwriting standards of a loan. They verified you made what you said you made in annual income. So if I said I made 100,000, they made me show them my tax statement, my W-2 form, which proves I make it. And so that's part one. You had to prove you made that. Part two, your entire monthly payment of principal and interest can't be more than 35% of your gross income.
Okay.
So I can only spend 1/3 of my income on my house. And if it's higher than that, they won't give me the loan.
Okay.
Number three, I had to have a 20% down payment. So for the average house in the US that costs $300,000, they're not going to give me that house until I can write them a check for $60,000. If I write a check for $60,000, I'm not walking away from that house. I will lose my down payment. These option arms, first, 0 down payment. Wow. So I don't even need $1 to buy the house, which led people to buy 4 or 5 or 6 houses. They were just investments. Secondly, they were called liar loans. There was no income verification. The mortgage broker would tell me, to get this loan, you need to make $400,000. How much do you make? And the person borrowing money would say, $400,000, and that was it. It went no further. What we found was in these pools, one person owned 5 houses on average, all of which they listed as owner-occupied. So they said, all 5 of these houses are my primary residence. So I realized these loans are much more like a credit card loan, which historically in downturn does very badly. Why? I have no investment in this house, not 1 penny. I've lied about my ability to make the monthly mortgage payment, and I have 5 separate houses I need to make the payment on. Finally, they gave you the option each month of paying your full amortizing monthly bill, which covers all of my interest and a little principal. These loans let you pay each month an amount so small it didn't even cover the interest. So my loan's getting bigger every month. This is on top of an unprecedented increase in housing prices because the availability of these loans was driving everyone to invest. So we saw home price appreciation like we had never seen. So I said, forget history of mortgage loans. These are a completely different product. And a lot of these were also subprime FICO borrowers. So they had many late payments on something as simple as a telephone bill. So I said, don't look at history as a guide, look at the history of subprime credit cards, which tend to see up to 20% to 30% default during economic downturn. That ended up being very close to the actual performance of these deals.
And basically, right, the crisis was triggered by the variable rates that started, to come out. Is this true?
Yes.
Okay.
So as interest rates rose, these were all floating rate mortgages, which are way more dangerous than fixed rate. So not only did the person see their interest rate go from 3 or 4% up to 8%, they had only a limited number of months where they could make that lower option arm payment, which was only maybe $200 a month. Once you do that for 12 consecutive months, you now have to pay a fully amortizing monthly payment, which means my payment goes from $200 up to like $2,000, and interest rates were rising. So they were buying these houses thinking after 3 or 4 months, they could flip them for a gain. No one was buying houses once prices had gone up that far.
And for example, like you were covering this sector before, or like you went through some piece of information, some piece of news that made you like get this idea, like let's look inside these loans and see what's inside, and you figured out that there was nothing basically.
So this is a great advice for how do you spot the next bubble, which is potentially going to crack. You look at subsectors of the S&P 500 that have had the biggest return over 1 or 5 years. That would have led you to every bubble in history, because before it cracks, it tends to go up way bigger than any other sector. Telecom tech, 1998 to 2002, was by far the best performing sector. That's the one that was a bubble. The housing market went up over that prior 10-year period like 300%. It was the biggest short-term gain in housing prices in the history of the US. So that's where I looked. And I wanted to know, is this justified or is it a bubble? So that's what led me to look at that sector, the massive gains over the 5-year period.
Crazy, like, and people believed you when you told them this. Like when you pitched this idea, these facts, did people believe you, or initially they were, skeptical about this? Because everybody believed that the housing market, correct me if I'm wrong, like was untouchable basically.
So we at a deep value distress firm, what we make all of our money on is having opinions that no one else has and having the research that backed it up. It was a 1-hour conversation with my boss and his boss. So I spent 1 hour showing them the underwriting standards of these loans and their mouths dropped. They couldn't believe people would make these loans. And when I said to make so we bet a total of about $5 billion. We bet on $5 billion in notional. All we needed was losses to be 5% in these pools. That's all I need. And subprime credit cards had losses of 25 to 30% in downturn. Well, this is a subprime borrower who has not one penny invested, who can't possibly keep up with the housing payment, and I felt like losses of 10% would be the best it could be, and I only need losses of 5%. So they agreed after 1 hour, we were able to ultimately short $5 billion worth. Losses hit that 5% level within 7 months later. So Wall Street had to write us a check for $5 billion.
Wow, amazing. And like, how did it feel to, be right in a situation like
this
that?
was a period of time where the economy wasn't doing well, so there were very few potential good investments. So having this position that was making money when almost every other position was going down, the 25th day of every single month was when you got the reports of how these mortgages were doing. And my boss and I would run into a room and we would look at this that would show you how many of these mortgages are rolling to 30 days delinquent, how many 60, how many 90, and we described it as like Christmas every single time. It was just getting worse and worse and worse. And remember, we're just making a synthetic bet. We don't actually have any involvement with these loans, and no one is getting displaced from their house. These are speculative investments. This person didn't put any money into the house, so when it goes bad, they still have their primary residence. They lose the 4 houses that they went and tried to speculatively buy, but we felt good that this is not us owning a house and going and repossessing it and kicking people out. So we would not have wanted to make that bet if that's how we had to make our money. We just basically went to Wall Street and said, losses in these pools will be above 5%. The second they had to pay us full notional. So I love that everyone else was losing 10, 15, 20% that year, and we were up huge because of this one bet. So it was the most amazing feeling of my investment career.
Like the instrument that you were using were credit default swap, correct me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, it was a subsection of credit default swap called a pay-as-you-go swap.
Okay. How would you describe it to someone that doesn't have proper, financial background in a few words? So to give a bit of insight, to
so I identify any pool of mortgages that exist in the world. So I could find one RMBS issue that was issued 2 years ago that would have a name like MSCI 2006-1. All that means is Morgan Stanley put together a pool of mortgages in 2006, maybe 1,000 mortgages into a pool. All I'm doing is betting that the triple B tranche of that pool, which attaches at 3%, meaning once there's 3% losses in that pool, I start losing money, and once losses hit 5, that pool is completely wiped out.
Okay. I
I have to basically pay 200 basis points a year on notional, which is just 2%. So if I bet on $5 billion, I have to pay Wall Street $100 million a year as long as this pool does not default. And if it does default, they pay me notional. So that's $5 billion. So while it doesn't default, I pay them $100 million. The moment it does and is completely written down, they pay me 5. So it was basically a 50-to-1 payoff. And we didn't even have to make the first full year of payments because it was written to zero before a year went up.
Wow, amazing. And so, like, can we tell what was the profit for the team, for the fund?
Yeah, so as I said, we did $5 billion in notional. Hedge funds routinely keep 20% of profit. Sure. So 20% of $5 billion is $1 billion. $1 billion. So the place I worked is notoriously quiet. They don't want people to know how successful they are, but I found it just the most amazing experience of my life that they would listen to me after, a couple weeks of work to 1 hour and they say yes, where every other hedge fund in the entire country that we spoke with looked at the trade and decided not to do it. Why? Because the US housing market had never had a downturn before. And we would say, well, the conditions were never like this before. Yes. So I just love being able to work with people who are willing to think flexibly.
Yes. Well, willing to look actually at numbers, right? And without preconjections, and it is cool because it feels like being able to predict the future. For example, one question for you is, in your opinion, what makes a good investor? So basically, it is something that you're born with, it's a gift, or practice makes perfect?
So what I've seen in my life are there are two types of successful investors. One, people who are smarter than other people. Two, people who are smart enough but work a lot harder. Every hedge fund analyst that I've ever seen that was good fell into one of those two buckets. So the top hedge funds generally go across the entire country and they go to the most prestigious programs like Goldman Sachs Investment Banking. And they interview the top people finishing those programs. And since they can pay so much better than anyone else, they get them. Second, people who are reasonably smart, they had a good education, they can pass the interview, but they work 120 hours a week. So to me, you can, if you have enough intelligence to get through a reasonable finance program and you work hard enough, a lot of people can be reasonably good investors. The elite investors, in my opinion, have been people who were born with very high intelligence. The people I worked with at that hedge fund were the smartest people I had ever worked with in my life.
Wow, that's crazy. That's great. Thank you so much once again to Professor John DeVoy.
Sure.
And see you next time on another episode of Vision Business Talks.
Thank you
so
very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.